Jason Huffman, I would say surprise, but it's no surprise to you because you bought this for yourself, and I would tell you who I am, but you know that already, and I would tell you about the Cameo process, but you went through it, so I'm going to get straight to the meat of the matter. You're from Evansville, Indiana. You're a longtime wrestling fan. I assume that you've been down to the Coliseum on Court Street there. I know that over the last number of years, they've run some outlaw mud shows there in the past, but that was the home of pro wrestling in Evansville for so many years. The home of the flattest soft drinks and the blandest hot dogs in the history of sports, right there at the Evansville Coliseum. But the question that you asked me that I'm going to try to address here is, who is on my Mount Rushmore of the greatest technical wrestlers? I got to be honest with you. Besides being somewhat tired of the Mount Rushmore question, there's really no way to answer this because of the time frames and the different eras involved in wrestling. You can't compare people from the 30s and 40s to people from the 80s and 90s. You can't compare them to the people of modern day. Honestly, there's not a lot of great technical wrestlers out there these days. They don't teach that stuff anymore. But when you go back to the pioneer days, all the top wrestlers were great technical wrestlers because there wasn't that much show business thrown in yet. There was a little ha-ha and there was some color, but most of the guys were wrestling. So the top guys, whether it be Strangler Lewis or Dick Sheekat or Joe Stecker, they were legitimately the best wrestlers in the world, and they just chose to work to make more money. As the wrestling business evolved and television came in, then the speed picked up and people's attention spans got a little shorter and there was more showbiz thrown in, but still a guy like Lou Thesz, who trained under Lewis, who trained under so many of the pioneer shooters, and who bridged the gap between the 30s and 40s and the television era of the 50s and 60s. Thesz was technically the most technically proficient wrestler in the business at that time. But then you also got to look at the way that things evolved with the entry of NCAA champions and amateur wrestling greats. And that happened in the 30s and 40s as well. But you go through Danny Hodge from the 50s, Jack Briscoe from the 60s, up to Kurt Angle. They were all NCAA heavyweight wrestling champions in college. And as a result, whether they were pro wrestling, whether they were amateur wrestling, they were the best in the world at what they did. And then you can go a couple of decades farther, and guys like Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit, who weren't legitimate amateur shooters on a mainstream basis on a high level, but they were trained so diligently in technical wrestling, and that was their style and what they brought to the forefront, that they certainly would deserve spots in the list of some of the top technical wrestlers. So it just depends on your era. Do you want to go back to the 30s? Do you want to come to the television era? Do you want to come to modern day? Do you want to consider only great amateurs, or do you want to consider pros that were trained in a technical style? All those guys and more that I mentioned would fit in, or more that I didn't mention would fit into that. So there really is no way to pick the four best. It's the four best of that era, or, maybe the four best in a certain genre, but the four best of all time, it's tough. So I'm copping out on your question, but those guys that I mentioned and a bunch more, Briscoe, Angle, Hodge, Thesz, Malenko, Benoit, if you're making a list of the greatest technical wrestlers in history, they would definitely be there. I've taken too much of your time now, Jason. I appreciate you asking the question. Thank you. Fuck you, and bye-bye.